The Wind in the Willows, by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 11. Like summer tempests came his tears. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, and gave a great hoist and a pull, and the water-logged Toad came up slowly but surely over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hole, streaked with mud and weeds to be sure, and with the water streaming off him, but happy and high-spirited as of old, now that he found himself once more in the house of a friend, and dodgings and evasions were over, and he could lay aside a disguise that was unworthy of his position, and wanted such a lot of living up to. "Oh, Ratty," he cried, "I've been through such times since I saw you last, you can't think. Such trials, such sufferings, and all so nobly borne. Then such escapes, such disguises, such subterfuges, and all so cleverly planned and carried out. Been in prison, got out of it, of course. Been thrown in a canal, swam ashore, stole a horse, sold him for a large sum of money, humbugged everybody, made 'em all do exactly what I wanted. Oh, I am a smart Toad, and no mistake. What do you think my last exploit was? Just hold on till I tell you. Toad," said the Water-rat, gravely and firmly, "you go off upstairs at once, and take off that old cotton rag that looks as if it might formerly have belonged to some washerwoman, and clean yourself thoroughly, and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman, if you can, for a more shabby, bedraggled, disreputable-looking object than you I never set eyes on in my whole life. Now stop swaggering and arguing, and be off. I'll have something to say to you later." Toad was at first inclined to stop and do some talking back at him. He had had enough of being ordered about when he was in prison, and here was a thing being begun all over again, apparently, and by a rat too. However, he caught sight of himself in the looking-glass over the hat-stand, with the rusty black bonnet perched rakishly over one eye, and he changed his mind and went very quickly and humbly up to the rat's dressing-room. There he had a thorough wash and brush-up, changed his clothes, and stood for a long time before the glass, contemplating himself with pride and pleasure, and thinking what utter idiots all the people must have been to have ever mistaken him for one moment for a washerwoman. By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table, and very glad Toad was to see it, for he had been through some trying experiences, and had taken much hard exercise since the excellent breakfast provided for him by the gipsy. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness, and presence of mind in emergencies, and cunning in tight places, and rather making out that he had been having a gay and highly coloured experience. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became. When at last Toad had talked himself to a standstill, there was silence for a while, and then the rat said, "Now, Toady, I don't want to give you pain after all you've been through already, but seriously, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? On your own admission, you've been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified out of your life, insulted, jeered at, and ignominiously flung into the water, by a woman, too. Where's the amusement in that? Where does the fun come in? And all because you must needs go and steal a motor car. You know that you've never had anything but trouble from motor cars from the moment you first set eyes on one. But if you will be mixed up with them, as you generally are, 5 minutes after you've started, why steal them? Be a cripple if you think it's exciting. Be a bankrupt for a change if you've set your mind on it, but why choose to be a convict? When are you going to be sensible and think of your friends and try and be a credit to them? Do you suppose it's any pleasure to me, for instance, to hear animals saying, as I go about, that I'm the chap who keeps company with jailbirds?" Now, it was a very comforting point in Toad's character that he was a thoroughly good-hearted animal, and never minded being jawed by those who were his real friends. And even when most set upon a thing, he was always able to see the other side of the question. So, although while the rat was talking so seriously, he kept saying to himself mutinously, "It was fun, though, awful fun," and making strange suppressed noises inside him, kick and poop and other sounds resembling stifled snorts, or the opening of soda-water bottles. Yet, when the rat had quite finished, he heaved a deep sigh, and said very nicely and humbly, "Quite right, Ratty. How sound you always are. Yes, I've been a conceited old ass, I can quite see that. But now I'm going to be a good Toad, and not do it any more. As for motor cars, I've not been at all so keen about them since my last ducking in that river of yours. The fact is, while I was hanging on to the edge of your hole and getting my breath, I had a sudden idea, a really brilliant idea connected with motor boats. Oh, there, don't take on so, old chap, and stamp and upset things. It was only an idea, and we won't talk about it any more. We'll have have our coffee and a smoke and a quiet chat, and then I'm going to stroll quietly down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own and set things going again along the old lines. I've had enough of adventures. I shall lead a quiet, steady, respectable life, pottering about my property and improving it, and doing a little landscape gardening at times. There will always be a bit of dinner for my friends when they come to see me, and I shall keep a pony chaise to jog about the country, and just as I used to in the old days before I got restless and wanted to do things." "Stroll quietly down to Toad Hall?" cried the Rat, greatly excited. "What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard?" "Heard what?" said Toad, turning rather pale. "Go on, Ratty, quick, don't spare me. What haven't I heard?" "Do you mean to tell me," shouted the Rat, thumping with his little fist upon the table, "that you've heard nothing about the Stoats and Weasels?" "What, the Wild Wooders?" cried Toad, trembling in every limb. "No, not a word. What have they been doing?" "And have they been in taken Toad Hall?" continued the Rat. Toad leaned his elbows on the table and his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each of his eyes, overflowed and splashed on the table. Plop, plop. "Go on, Ratty," he murmured presently. "Tell me all. The worst is over. I'm an animal again. I can bear it." "When you got into that trouble of yours," said the Rat, slowly and impressively. "I mean, when you disappeared from society for a time, over that misunderstanding about a machine, you know." Toad merely nodded. "Well, it was a good deal talked about down here naturally," continued the Rat, "not only along the riverside, but even in the wild wood. Animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stood up for you and said you had been infamously treated, and there was no justice to be had in the land nowadays. But the wildwood animals said hard things, and served you right, and it was time this sort of thing was stopped. And they got very cocky, and went about saying you were done for this time. You would never come back. Never, never." Toad nodded once more, keeping silence. "That's the sort of little beasts they are," the Rat went on. "But Mole and Badger, they stuck out, through thick and thin, that you would come back again somehow. They didn't know exactly how, but somehow." Toad began to sit up in his chair again, and to smirk a little. "They argued from history," continued the Rat. "They said that no criminal laws had ever been known to prevail against cheek and plausibility such as yours, combined with the power of a long purse. So they arranged to move their things into Toad Hall, and sleep there, and keep it aired, and have it all ready for you when they turned up. They didn't guess what was going to happen, of course. Still, they had their suspicions of the wildwood animals. Now I come to the most painful and tragic part of my story. One dark night, it was a very dark night, and blowing hard too, and raining simply cats and dogs, a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage to the front entrance. Simultaneously, a body of desperate ferrets, advancing through the kitchen garden, possessed themselves of the backyard and offices, while a company of skirmishing stoats, who stuck at nothing, occupied the conservatory and the billiard-room, and held the French windows opening onto the lawn. The Mole and Badger were sitting by the fire in the smoking-room, telling stories and suspecting nothing, for it wasn't a night for any animals to be out in, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon them from every side. They made the best fight they could, but what was the good? They were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can two animals do against hundreds? They took and beat them severely with sticks, those two poor faithful creatures, and turned them out into the cold and the wet, with many insulting and uncalled-for remarks." Here the unfeeling Toad broke into a snigger, and then pulled himself together and tried to look particularly solemn. "And the Wildwooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since," continued the Rat, "and going on simply anyhow. Lying in bed half the day, and breakfast all hours, and the place in such a mess, I'm told, it's not fit to be seen. Eating your grub, drinking your drink, and making bad jokes about you, and singing vulgar songs about, well, prisons and magistrates and policemen, horrible personal songs with no humour in them. And they're telling the tradespeople and everybody that they've come to stay for good." "Oh, have they?" said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. "I'll jolly soon see about that." "It's no good, Toad," called the Rat after him. "You'd better come back and sit down. You'll only get into trouble." But the Toad was off, and there was no holding him. He marched rapidly down the road, his stick over his shoulder, fuming and muttering to himself in his anger till he got near his front gate, when suddenly there popped up from behind the palings a long yellow ferret with a gun. "Who comes there?" said the ferret sharply. "Stuff and nonsense," said Toad very angrily. "What do you mean by talking to me like that? Come out of there at once, or I'll—" The ferret never said a word, but he brought his gun up to his shoulder. Toad prudently dropped flat in the road, and bang! A bullet whistled over his head. The startled Toad scrambled to his feet and scampered off down the road as hard as he could, and as he ran he heard the ferret laughing, and other horrid thin little laughs, taking it up and carrying on the sound. He went back, very crestfallen, and told the water rat. "What did I tell you?" said the rat. "It's no good. They've got sentries posted, and they're all armed. You must just wait." Still Toad was not inclined to give in all at once, so he got out the boat and set off rowing up the river to where the garden front of Toad Hall came down to the waterside. Arriving within sight of his old home, he rested on his oars and surveyed the land cautiously. All seemed very peaceful and deserted and quiet. He could see the whole front of Toad Hall glowing in the evening sunshine, the pigeons settling by twos and threes along the straight line of the roof, the garden a blaze of flowers, the creek that led up to the boathouse, the little wooden bridge that crossed it, all tranquil, uninhabited, apparently waiting for his return. He would try the boathouse first, he thought. Very warily he paddled to the mouth of the creek, and was just passing under the bridge, when crash! A great stone dropped from above, smashed through the bottom of the boat. It filled and sank, and Toad found himself struggling in deep water. Looking up, he saw two stoats leaning over the parapet of the bridge and watching him with great glee. "It'll be your head next time, Toady," they called out to him. The indignant Toad swam to the shore, while the stoats laughed and laughed, supporting each other, and laughed again till they nearly had two fits. That is, one fit each, of course. The Toad retraced his weary way on foot, and related his disappointing experiences to the water rat once more. "Well, what did I tell you?" said the rat very crossly. "And now look here. See what you've been and done. Lost me my boat that I was so fond of, that's what you've done. And simply ruined that nice suit of clothes that I lent you. Really, Toad, of all the trying animals, I wonder you managed to keep any friends at all." The Toad saw at once how wrongly and foolishly he had acted. He admitted his errors and wrong-headedness, and made a full apology to Rat for losing his boat and spoiling his clothes, and he wound up by saying, with that frank self-surrender which always disarmed his friends' criticism and won them back to his side, "Ratty, I see that I've been a headstrong and wilful Toad. Henceforth, believe me, I will be humble and submissive, and will take no action without your kind advice and full approval." "If that is really so," said the good-natured Rat, already appeased, "then my advice to you is, considering the lateness of the hour, to sit down and have your supper, which will be on the table in a minute, and be very patient. For I am convinced that we can do nothing until we have seen the Mole and the Badger, and heard their latest news, and held conference, and taken their advice in this difficult matter." Yes, of course, the Mole and the Badger," said the Toad lightly. "And what's become of them, the dear fellows? I'd forgotten all about them." "Well, you may ask," said the Rat reproachfully. "While you were riding about the country in expensive motor cars, and galloping proudly on blood horses, and breakfasting on the fat of the land, those two poor devoted animals have been camping out in the open in every sort of weather, living very rough by day, and living very hard at night, watching over your house, patrolling your boundaries, keeping a constant eye on the stoats and the weasels, scheming and planning, and contriving how to get your property back for you. You don't deserve to have such true and loyal friends, Toad, you don't, really. Some day when it's too late, you'll be sorry you didn't value them more while you had them." "I'm an ungrateful beast, I know," sobbed Toad, shedding bitter tears. "Let me go out and find them, out in the cold, dark night, and share their hardships, and try to prove— Hold on a bit, surely I hear the chink of dishes on a tray. Supper's here at last, hooray! Come on, Ratty!" The Rat remembered that poor Toad had been on prison fare for a considerable time, and that large allowances had therefore to be made. He followed him to the table accordingly, and hospitably encouraged him in his gallant efforts to make up for past privations. They had just finished their meal, and resumed their armchairs, when there came a heavy knock at the door. Toad was nervous, but the Rat, nodding mysteriously at him, went straight up to the door and opened it, and in walked Mr. Badger. He had all the appearances of one who for some nights had been kept away from home and all its little comforts and conveniences. His shoes were covered with mud, and he was looking very rough and touzled, but then he had never been a very smart man, the Badger, at the best of times. He came solemnly up to Toad, shook him by the paw, and said, "Welcome home, Toad. Alas, what am I saying? Home indeed. This is a poor home-coming. Unhappy Toad." Then he turned his back on him, sat down to the table, drew his chair up, and helped himself to a large slice of cold pie. Toad was quite alarmed at this very serious and portentous style of greeting, but the Rat whispered to him, "Never mind, don't take any notice, and don't say anything to him just yet. He's always rather low and despondent when he's wanting his victuals. In half an hour's time he'll be quite a different animal." So they waited in silence, and presently there came another and lighter knock. The Rat, with a nod to Toad, went to the door and ushered in the Mole, very shabby and unwashed, with bits of hay and straw sticking in his fur. "Hooray! Here's old Toad!" cried the Mole, his face beaming. "Fancy having you back again!" And he began to dance round him. "We never dreamt you would turn up so soon. Why, you must have managed to escape, you clever, ingenious, intelligent Toad." The Rat, alarmed, pulled him by the elbow, but it was too late. Toad was puffing and swelling already. "Clever? Oh, no," he said. "I'm not really clever, according to my friends. I've only broken out of the strongest prison in England, that's all, and captured a railway train and escaped on it, that's all, and disguised myself and gone about the country humbugging everybody, that's all. Oh, no, I'm a stupid ass, I am. I'll tell you one or two of my little adventures, Mole, and you shall judge for yourself." "Well, well," said the Mole, moving toward the supper table. "Supposing you talk while I eat. Not a bite since breakfast. Oh, my, oh, my." And he sat down and helped himself liberally to cold beef and pickles. Toad straddled the hearthrug, thrust his paw into his trouser pocket, and pulled out a handful of silver. "Look at that," he cried, displaying it. "That's not so bad, is it, for a few minutes' work? And how you think I done it, Mole? Horse-stealing, that's how I done it." "Go on, Toad," said the Mole, immensely interested. "Toad, do be quiet, please," said the Rat. "Don't you egg him on, Mole, when you know what he is. But please tell us as soon as possible what the position is, and what's best to be done, now that Toad's back at last." "The position's about as bad as it can be," replied the Mole grumpily. "And as for what's to be done, blest if I know. The Badger and I have been round and round the place by night and by day, always the same thing. Sentries posted everywhere, guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us, always an animal on the lookout, and when they see us, my, how they do laugh! That's what annoys me the most." "It's a very difficult situation," said the Rat, reflecting deeply. "But I think I see now in the depths of my mind what Toad really ought to do. I will tell you. He ought to—" "No, he oughtn't!" shouted the Mole, with his mouth full. "Nothing of the sort. You don't understand. What he ought to do is he ought to—" "Well, I shan't do it anyway," cried Toad, getting excited. "I'm not going to be ordered about by you fellows. It's my house we're talking about, and I know exactly what to do, and I'll tell you. I'm going to—" By this time they were all three talking at once, at the top of their voices, and the noise was simply deafening, when a thin, dry voice made itself heard, saying, "Be quiet at once, all of you!" And instantly everyone was silent. It was the Badger, who, having finished his pie, had turned round in his chair and was looking at them severely. When he saw that he had secured their attention, and that they were evidently waiting for him to address them, he turned back to the table again and reached out for the cheese. And so great was the respect commanded by the solid qualities of that admirable animal, that not another word was uttered until he had quite finished his repast, and brushed the crumbs from his knees. The Toad fidgeted a good deal, but the Rat held him firmly down. When the Badger had quite done, he got up from his seat and stood before the fireplace, reflecting deeply. At last he spoke. "Toad," he said severely, "you bad, troublesome little animal, aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father, my old friend, would have said if he had been here tonight and known of all your goings-on?" Toad, who was on the sofa by this time, with his legs up, rolled over on his face, shaken by sobs of contrition. "There, there," went on the Badger more kindly. "Never mind. Stop crying. We're going to let bygones be bygones, and try and turn over a new leaf. But what the Mole says is quite true. The Stoats are on guard at every point, and they make the best sentinels in the world. It's quite useless to think of attacking the place. They're too strong for us." "Then it's all over," sobbed the Toad, crying into the sofa cushions. "I shall go and enlist for a soldier, and never see my dear Toad Hall any more." "Oh, come, come, cheer up, Toady," said the Badger. "There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I haven't said my last word yet. Now I'm going to tell you a great secret." Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes. Secrets had an immense attraction for him, because he could never keep one, and enjoyed the sort of unhallowed thrill he experienced when he went and told another animal, and after having faithfully promised not to. "There is an underground passage," said the Badger impressively, "that leads from the river-bank, quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall." "Oh, nonsense, Badger," said Toad rather airily. "You've been listening to some of the yarns they spin in the public-houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall, inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you." "My young friend," said the Badger with great severity, "your father, who was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some others I know, was a particular friend of mine and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. He discovered that passage. He didn't make it, of course, that was done hundreds of years before he ever came to live there, and he repaired it and cleaned it out because he thought it might come in useful some day in case of trouble or danger, and he showed it to me. "Don't let my son know about it," he said. "He's a good boy, but very light and volatile in character, and simply cannot hold his tongue. If he's ever in a real fix, and it would be of use to him, you may tell him about the secret passage, but not before." The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he brightened up immediately, like the good fellow he was. "Well, well," he said, "perhaps I am a bit of a talker. A popular fellow such as I am, my friends get round me. We chaff, we sparkle, we tell witty stories, and somehow my tongue gets wagging. I have the gift of conversation. I've been told I ought to have a salon, whatever that may be. Never mind. Go on, Badger. How's this passage of yours going to help us?" "I've found out a thing or two lately," continued the Badger. "I got Otter to disguise himself as a sweep and call at the back door with brushes over his shoulder, asking for a job. There's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort whatever." "But the sentinels will be posted as usual," remarked the Rat. "Exactly," said the Badger. "That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels, and that is where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry next to the dining hall." "Aha! That squeaky board in the butler's pantry," said Toad. "Now I understand it." "We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry," cried the Mole. "With our pistols and swords and sticks," shouted the Rat. "And rush in upon them," said the Badger. "And whack 'em, and whack 'em, and whack 'em," cried the Toad in ecstasy, running round and round the room and jumping over the chairs. "Very well, then," said the Badger, resuming his usual dry manner. "Our plan is settled, and there's nothing more for you to argue and squabble about. So, as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once. We will make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the morning tomorrow." Toad, of course, went off to bed dutifully with the rest. He knew better than to refuse, though he was feeling much too excited to sleep. But he had had a long day, with many events crowded into it, and sheets and blankets were very friendly and comforting things after plain straw, and not too much of it, spread on the stone floor of a draughty cell, and his head had not been many seconds on his pillow before he was snoring happily. Naturally, he dreamt a good deal, about roads that ran away from him just when he wanted them, and canals that chased and caught him, and a barge that was sailing into the banquet hall with his week's washing, just as he was giving a dinner party, and he was alone in the secret passage pushing onward, but it twisted and turned round and shook itself and sat up on its end, yet somehow at the last he found himself back in Toad Hall, safe and triumphant, with all his friends gathered round him, earnestly assuring him that he really was a clever toad. He slept till a late hour the next morning, and by the time he got down he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast some time before. The Mole had slipped off somewhere by himself, without telling anyone where he was going to. The Badger sat in the armchair reading the paper, and not concerning himself in the slightest about what was going to happen that very evening. The Rat, on the other hand, was running round the room busily, with his arms full of weapons of every kind, distributing them in 4 little heaps on the floor, and saying excitedly under his breath as he ran, "Here's a sword for the Rat, here's a sword for the Mole, here's a sword for the Toad, here's a sword for the Badger, here's a pistol for the Rat, here's a pistol for the Mole, here's a pistol for the Toad, here's a pistol for the Badger," and so on, in a regular rhythmic way, while the 4 little heaps gradually grew and grew. "That's all very well, Rat," said Badger presently, looking at the busy little animal over the edge of his newspaper. "I'm not blaming you, but just let us once get past the stoats with those detestable guns of theirs, and I assure you we shan't want any swords or pistols. We 4, with our sticks, once we're inside the dining hall, and we shall clear the floor of all the lot of them in 5 minutes. I'd have done the whole thing by myself, only I didn't want to deprive you fellows of the fun." "It's as well to be on the safe side," said the Rat reflectively, polishing a pistol barrel in his sleeve and looking along it. The Toad, having finished his breakfast, picked up a stout stick and swung it vigorously, belabouring imaginary animals. "I'll learn 'em to steal my house," he cried. "I'll learn 'em, I'll learn 'em." "Do not say learn 'em, Toad," said the Rat, greatly shocked. "It's not good English." "What are you always nagging at Toad for?" inquired the Badger, rather peevishly. "What's the matter with his English? It's the same what I use myself, and if it's good enough for me, it ought to be good enough for you." "I'm very sorry," said the Rat humbly, "only I think it ought to be teach 'em, not learn 'em." "But we don't want to teach 'em," replied the Badger. "We want to learn 'em, learn 'em, learn 'em, and what's more, we're going to do it too." "Oh, very well, have it your own way," said the Rat. He was getting rather muddled about it himself, and presently he retired into a corner where he could be heard muttering, "Learn 'em, teach 'em, learn 'em," till the Badger told him rather sharply to leave off. Presently the Mole came tumbling into the room, evidently very pleased with himself. "I've been having such fun," he began at once. "I've been getting a rise out of the stoats." "I hope you've been very careful, Mole," said the Rat anxiously. "I should hope so too," said the Mole confidently. "I got the idea when I went into the kitchen to see about Toad's breakfast being kept hot for him. I found that old washerwoman dress that he came home in yesterday hanging on a towel horse before the fire, so I put it on, and the bonnet as well, and the shawl, and off I went to Toad Hall as bold as you please. The sentries were on the lookout, of course, with their guns and their who comes there, and all the rest of their nonsense. 'Good morning, gentlemen,' says I, very respectful. 'Want any washing done today?' They looked at me very proud and stiff and haughty, and said, 'Go away, washerwoman, we don't do any washing on duty.' 'Or any other time,' says I. Wasn't I funny, Toad?" "Poor frivolous animal," said Toad very loftily. The fact is, he felt exceedingly jealous of Mole for what he had just done. It was exactly what he would have liked to have done himself, if only he had thought of it first, and hadn't gone and overslept himself. "Some of the stoats turned quite pink," continued the Mole, "and the sergeant in charge, he said to me, very short, he said, 'Now, run away, my good woman, run away. Don't keep my men idling and talking on their posts.' 'Run away?' says I. 'It won't be me that'll be running away in a very short time from now.' 'Oh, Moley! How could you?' said the Rat, dismayed. The Badger laid down his paper. I could see them pricking up their ears and looking at each other. Went on the Mole, and the sergeant said to them, 'Never mind her, she doesn't know what she's talking about.' 'Oh, don't I?' said I. 'Well, let me tell you this. My daughter, she washes for Mr. Badger, and that'll show you whether I know what I'm talking about, and you'll know pretty soon, too. 100 bloodthirsty badgers armed with rifles are going to attack Toad Hall this very night by way of the paddock. 6 boatloads of rats with pistols and cutlasses will come up the river and effect a landing in the garden, while a picked body of toads known as the diehards, or Death and Glory toads, will storm the orchard and carry everything before them, yelling for vengeance. There won't be much left of you to wash by the time they've done with you, unless you clear out while you have the chance.' Then I ran away, and when I was out of sight I hid, and presently I came creeping back along the ditch and took a peep at them through the hedge. They were all as nervous and flustered as could be, running all ways at once and falling over each other, and everyone giving orders to everybody else and not listening, and the sergeant kept sending off parties of stoats to distant parts of the grounds, and then sending other fellows to fetch 'em back again, and I heard them saying to each other, 'That's just like the weasels, they're to stop comfortably in the banquet hall and have feasts and toasts and songs and all sorts of fun, while we must stay on guard in the cold and dark, and in the end be cut to pieces by bloodthirsty badgers.'" "Oh, you silly ass, Mole!" cried Toad. "You've been and spoilt everything." "Mole," said the Badger, in his dry, quiet way, "I perceive you have more sense in your little finger than some other animals have in the whole of their fat bodies. You have managed excellently, and I begin to have great hopes of you. Good Mole! Clever Mole!" The Toad was simply wild with jealousy, more especially as he couldn't make out for the life of him what the Mole had done that was so particularly clever. But fortunately for him, before he could show his temper or expose himself to the Badger's sarcasm, the bell rang for luncheon. It was a simple but sustaining meal, bacon and broad beans and a macaroni pudding, and when they had quite done, the Badger settled himself into an armchair and said, "Well, we've got our work cut out for us tonight, and it will probably be pretty late before we're quite through with it, so I'm just going to take 40 winks while I can." And he drew a handkerchief over his face, and was soon snoring. The anxious and laborious Rat at once resumed his preparations, and started running between his 4 little heaps, muttering, "Here's a belt for the Rat, here's a belt for the Mole, here's a belt for the Toad, here's a belt for the Badger," and so on, with every fresh accoutrement he produced, to which there seemed really no end. So the Mole drew his arm through Toad's, led him out into the open air, shoved him into a wicker chair, and made him tell all his adventures from beginning to end, which Toad was only too willing to do. The Mole was a good listener, and Toad, with no one to check his statements or to criticise in an unfriendly spirit, rather let himself go. Indeed, much that he related belonged more properly to the category of what might have happened had I only thought of it in time instead of 10 minutes afterwards. Those are always the best and the raciest adventures, and why should they not be truly ours, as much as the somewhat inadequate things that really come off? End of chapter 11.
The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 12. The Return of Ulysses. When it began to grow dark, the Rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlour, stood each of them up alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. He was very earnest and thorough-going about it, and the affair took quite a long time. First, there was a belt to go round each animal, and then a sword to be stuck into each belt, and then a cutlass on the other side to balance it. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. The Badger laughed good-humouredly and said, "All right, Ratty. It amuses you, and it doesn't hurt me. I'm going to do all I've got to do with this here stick." But the Rat only said, "Please, Badger, you know I shouldn't like you to blame me afterwards and say I had forgotten anything." When all was quite ready, the Badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, 'cause I'm very pleased with him. Rat next, Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter so much as usual, or you'll be sent back, as sure as fate." The Toad was so anxious not to be left out that he took up the inferior position assigned to him without a murmur, and the animals set off. The Badger led them along the river for a little way, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the river bank, a little above the water. The Mole and the Rat followed silently, swinging themselves successfully into the hole as they had seen the Badger do. But when it came to Toad's turn, of course he managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash and a squeal of alarm. He was hauled out by his friends, rubbed down and wrung out hastily, comforted, and set on his legs. But the Badger was seriously angry, and told him that the very next time he made a fool of himself he would most certainly be left behind. So, at last they were in the secret passage, and the cutting-out expedition had really begun. It was cold, and dark, and damp, and low, and narrow, and poor Toad began to shiver, partly from dread of what might be before him, partly because he was wet through. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind a little in the darkness. Then he heard the Rat call out warningly, "Come on, Toad!" And a terror seized him of being left behind, alone in the darkness, and he "came on" with such a rush that he upset the Rat into the Mole, and the Mole into the Badger, and for a moment all was confusion. The Badger thought they were being attacked from behind, and, as there was no room to use a stick or a cutlass, drew a pistol, and was on the point of putting a bullet into Toad. When he found out what had really happened, he was very angry indeed, and said, "Now this time that tiresome Toad shall be left behind." But Toad whimpered, and the other two promised that they would be answerable for his good conduct. And at last the Badger was pacified, and the procession moved on, only this time the Rat brought up the rear, with a firm grip on the shoulder of Toad. So they groped and shuffled along, with their ears pricked up, and their paws on their pistols, till at last the Badger said, "We ought by now to be pretty nearly under the hall." Then suddenly they heard, far away as it might be, and yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. The Toad's nervous terrors all returned, but the Badger only remarked placidly, "They are going it, the weasels." The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them. "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" they heard, and the stamping of little feet on the floor, and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table. "What a time they're having!" said the Badger. "Come on!" They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap-door that led up into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of their being overheard. The Badger said, "Now, boys, all together!" and the four of them put their shoulders to the trap-door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall where their unconscious enemies were carousing. The noise, as they emerged from the passage, was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying, "Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer." Great applause. "But before I resume my seat," renewed cheering, "I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad." Great laughter. "Good Toad. Modest Toad. Honest Toad." Shrieks of merriment. "Only just let me get at him," muttered Toad, grinding his teeth. "Hold hard a minute," said the Badger, restraining him with difficulty. "Get ready, all of you." "Let me sing you a little song," went on the voice, "which I have composed on the subject of Toad." Prolonged applause. Then the Chief Weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice. "Toady went a-pleasuring gaily down the street." The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced round at his comrades, and cried, "The hour is come! Follow me!" and flung the door open wide. My! What a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air! Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up at the windows. Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well might tables and chairs be upset, and glass and china be sent crashing on the floor, in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air; Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick, and shouting his awful war-cry, "A mole! A mole!" Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and every variety; Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad hoops that chilled them to the marrow. "Toad he went a-pleasuring!" he yelled. "I'll pleasure 'em!" And he went straight for the Chief Weasel. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, grey, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels; and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the Mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The Badger, resting from his labours, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow. "Mole," he said, "you're the best of fellows. Just cut along outside and look after those stoat sentries of yours, and see what they're doing. I've an idea that, thanks to you, we shan't have much trouble from them tonight." The Mole vanished promptly through a window, and the Badger bade the other two set a table on its legs again, pick up knives and forks and plates and glasses from the debris on the floor, and see if they could find materials for a supper. "I want some grub, I do," he said, in that rather common way he had of speaking. "Stir up your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich." Toad felt rather hurt that the Badger didn't say pleasant things to him, as he had to the Mole, and tell him what a fine fellow he was, and how splendidly he had fought; for he was particularly pleased with himself, and the way he had gone for the Chief Weasel, and sent him flying across the table with one blow of his stick. But he bustled about, and so did the Rat; and soon they found some guava jelly in a glass dish, and a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster salad. And in the pantry they came upon a basket full of French rolls and any quantity of cheese, butter, and celery. They were just about to sit down when the Mole clambered in through the window, chuckling, with an armful of rifles. "It's all over," he reported. "From what I can make out, as soon as the Stoats, who were very nervous and jumpy already, heard the shrieks and the yells and the uproar inside the hall, some of them threw down their rifles and fled. The others stood fast for a bit, but when the weasels came rushing out upon them they thought they were betrayed, and the Stoats grappled with the weasels, and the weasels fought to get away, and they wrestled and wriggled and punched each other, and rolled over and over till most of them rolled into the river. They've all disappeared by now, one way or another, and I've got their rifles, so that's all right." "Excellent and deserving animal," said the Badger, his mouth full of chicken and trifle. "Now, there's just one more thing I want you to do, Mole, before you sit down to your supper along of us. And I wouldn't trouble you, only I know I can trust you to see a thing done, and I wish I could say the same of everyone I know. I'd send a rat if he wasn't a poet. I want you to take those fellows on the floor there upstairs with you, and have some bedrooms cleaned out and tidied up and made really comfortable. See that they sweep under the beds, and put clean sheets and pillowcases on, and turn down one corner of the bedclothes just as you know it ought to be done. And have a can of hot water, and clean towels, and fresh cakes of soap put in each room. And then you can give them a licking apiece, if it's any satisfaction to you, and put them out by the back door, and we shan't see any more of them, I fancy. And then come along and have some of this cold tongue. It's first rate. I'm very pleased with you, Mole." The good-natured Mole picked up a stick, formed his prisoners up in a line on the floor, gave them the order, "Quick march!" and led his squad off to the upper floor. After a time he appeared again, smiling, and said that every room was ready and as clean as a new pin. "And I didn't have to lick them either," he added. "I thought, on the whole, they had had licking enough for one night, and the weasels, when I put the point to them, quite agreed with me, and said they wouldn't think of troubling me. They were very penitent, and said they were extremely sorry for what they had done, but it was all the fault of the Chief Weasel and the Stoats, and if ever they could do anything for us at any time to make up, we had only got to mention it. So I gave them a roll apiece, and let them out at the back, and off they ran as hard as they could." Then the Mole pulled his chair up to the table and pitched into the cold tongue; and Toad, like the gentleman he was, put all his jealousy from him, and said heartily, "Thank you kindly, dear Mole, for all your pains and trouble tonight, and especially for your cleverness this morning." The Badger was pleased at that, and said, "There spoke my brave Toad." So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valour, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks. The following morning, Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to breakfast disgracefully late, and found on the table a certain quantity of egg-shells, some fragments of cold and leathery toast, a coffee-pot 3/4 empty, and really very little else, which did not tend to improve his temper, considering that, after all, it was his own house. Through the French windows of the breakfast-room he could see the Mole and the Water-rat sitting in wicker chairs out on the lawn, evidently telling each other stories, roaring with laughter, and kicking their short legs up in the air. The Badger, who was in an arm-chair and deep in the morning paper, merely looked up and nodded when Toad entered the room. But Toad knew his man, so he sat down and made the best breakfast he could, merely observing to himself that he would get square with the others sooner or later. When he had nearly finished, the Badger looked up and remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule." "Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige. Though why on earth you should want to have a banquet in the morning I cannot understand. But you know I do not live to please myself, but merely to find out what my friends want, and then try and arrange it for 'em, you dear old Badger." "Don't pretend to be stupider than you really are," replied the Badger crossly. "And don't chuckle and splutter in your coffee while you're talking. It's not manners. What I mean is, the banquet will be at night, of course. But the invitations will have to be written and got off at once, and you've got to write 'em. Now, sit down at that table. There's stacks of letter paper on it, with Toad Hall at the top in blue and gold. And write invitations to all our friends, and if you stick to it, we shall get them out before luncheon. And I'll bear a hand too, and take my share of the burden. I'll order the banquet." "What!" cried Toad, dismayed. "Me stop indoors and write a lot of rotten letters on a jolly morning like this, when I want to go around my property and set everything and everybody to rights, and swagger about and enjoy myself? Certainly not. I'll see you—" "Stop a minute, though. Why, of course, dear Badger. What is my pleasure or convenience compared with that of others? You wish it done, and it shall be done. Go, Badger, order the banquet. Order what you like. Then join our young friends outside in their innocent mirth, oblivious of me and my cares and toils. I sacrifice this fair morning on the altar of duty and friendship." The Badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room, accordingly, in the direction of the kitchen, and as soon as the door had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing-table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and how he had laid the Chief Weasel flat, and he would hint at his adventures and what a career of triumph he had to tell about, and on the fly-leaf he would set out a sort of a programme of entertainment for the evening, something like this, as he sketched it out in his head: Speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad during the evening. Address by Toad. Synopsis: Our prison system, the waterways of Old England, horse-dealing and how to deal, property, its rights and its duties, back to the land, a typical English squire. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad will be sung in the course of the evening by the composer. The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon, at which hour it was reported to him that there was a small and rather bedraggled weasel at the door, inquiring timidly whether he could be of any service to the gentleman. Toad swaggered out, and found it was one of the prisoners of the previous evening, very respectful and anxious to please. He patted him on the head, shoved the bundle of invitations into his paw, and told him to cut along quick and deliver them as fast as he could, and if he liked to come back again in the evening, perhaps there might be a shilling for him, or again perhaps there mightn't. And the poor weasel seemed really quite grateful, and hurried off eagerly to do his mission. When the other animals came back to luncheon, very boisterous and breezy after a morning on the river, the mole, whose conscience had been pricking him, looked doubtfully at Toad, expecting to find him sulky or depressed. Instead, he was so uppish and inflated that the mole began to suspect something, while the rat and the badger exchanged significant glances. As soon as the meal was over, Toad thrust his paws deep into his trouser pockets, remarked casually, "Well, look after yourselves, you fellows. Ask for anything you want," and was swaggering off in the direction of the garden, where he wanted to think out an idea or two for his coming speeches, when the rat caught him by the arm. Toad rather suspected what he was after, and did his best to get away. But when the badger took him firmly by the other arm, he began to see that the game was up. The two animals conducted him between them into the small smoking-room that opened out of the entrance hall, shut the door, and put him into a chair. Then they both stood in front of him, while Toad sat silent and regarded them with much suspicion and ill-humour. "Now look here, Toad," said the rat. "It's about this banquet, and very sorry I am to have to speak to you like this. But we want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there are going to be no speeches and no songs. Try and grasp the fact that on this occasion we're not arguing with you, we're just telling you." Toad saw that he was trapped. They understood him. They saw through him. They had got ahead of him. His pleasant dream was shattered. "Mayn't I sing them just one little song?" he pleaded piteously. "No, not one little song," replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling lip of the poor disappointed Toad. "It's no good, Toady. You know well that your songs are all conceit and boasting and vanity, and your speeches are all self-praise and gross exaggeration and gas," put in the badger in his common way. "It's for your own good, Toady," went on the rat. "You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later, and now seems a splendid time to begin, a sort of turning point in your career. Please don't think that saying all this doesn't hurt me more than it hurts you." Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head, and the traces of strong emotion were visible on his features. "You have conquered, my friends," he said in broken accents. "It was, to be sure, but a small thing that I asked, merely leave to blossom and expand for yet one more evening, to let myself go and hear the tumultuous applause that always seems to me, somehow, to bring out my best qualities. However, you are right, I know, and I am wrong. Henceforth I will be a very different Toad. My friends, you shall never have occasion to blush for me again. But, oh dear, this is a hard world." And, pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room with faltering footsteps. "Badger," said the rat, "I feel like a brute. I wonder what you feel like." "Oh, I know," said the Badger gloomily. "But the thing had to be done. This good fellow has got to live here, and hold his own, and be respected. Would you have him a common laughing-stock, mocked and jeered at by stoats and weasels?" "Of course not," said the Rat. "And talking of weasels, it's lucky we came upon that little weasel, just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations. I suspected something, from what you told me, and had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. I confiscated the lot, and the good mole is now sitting in the blue boudoir filling up plain, simple invitation cards." At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling, in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room and arranged them in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and letting himself go, with uplifted voice he sang, to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw, Toad's last little song. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlours and bowling in the halls. There was crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls. When the Toad came home, when the Toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the Toad came home, bang go the drums, the cannons they are shooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the trumpets they are tooting, and the motor cars are hooting, as the hero comes. Shout, hooray! And let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud, in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's birthday. He sang this very loud, with great unction and expression, and when he had done he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water-jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and, unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled faintly, and murmured, "Not at all." Or sometimes, for a change, "On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arm round Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badger's was the master-mind. The Mole and the Water-Rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks, and did little or nothing." The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to everyone. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and the Rat, and always, when he looked, they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of "Toad! Speech! Speech from Toad! Song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and, by pressing delicacies on his guests, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war, in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the gaoler's daughter with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative; and the engine-driver, in his turn, was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Under severe compulsion from the Badger, even the barge-woman was, with some trouble, sought out, and the value of her horse discreetly made good to her, though Toad kicked terribly at this, holding himself to be an instrument of fate, sent to punish fat women with mottled arms who couldn't tell a real gentleman when they saw one. The amount involved, it was true, was not very burdensome, the gipsy's valuation being admitted by local assessors to be approximately correct. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed, so far as they were concerned, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the mouths of their holes, and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad. And that's the gallant water-rat, a terrible fighter, walking along o' him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often have heard your father tell." But when their infants were fractious, and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible grey Badger would up and get them. This was a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children. But it never failed to have its full effect. End of The Wind in the Willows, by Kenneth Grahame. Final chapter recorded by Catherine Eastman on February 20th, 2006.